I would like to thank sincerely and dearly Nadia and Nicola and Petros and Synthesis team, everybody involved, René, Nicole, everybody for making this opportunity of interaction possible. And thank you also for coming and spending your Saturday with us. It's a cool place, I admit, but still it's a Saturday, it's a summer Saturday. So my topic will be about curating photographic shows. It can be a very lengthy discussion, but we will cut short in the 45 minutes that we have, because there are many issues that we can develop during this talk. The first thing that I would like to share with you is that I never intended actually to be a curator. That somehow happened. I remember myself being trained as an artist, and then I got this position in the late 90s. Even before that, I was working since 1993 with our international festival in Thessaloniki, so it's already 3 decades, 30 full years of organizing and curating exhibitions. This is the exterior of our museum in Thessaloniki. My family is teasing me that this is your real home and not our place, because I spend too much, maybe too many hours there, and some of the hours that I'm not there, I am talking about it. So I'm not sure if this is my home, but it certainly is my second home. This is the position of it in the center of Thessaloniki, in a rather privileged spot, near the sea, near the center. For those of you who have never been around, if you happen to visit Thessaloniki, we'll be more than glad to have you attending and visiting one of the shows and see you again there. And this is a view of the exhibition hall in one of our previous shows. So to get into the main topic, I thought about what it could be useful in our discussions, and I thought maybe we should focus in 3 different cases of curatorial practice and use it as points of discussion. One of them is historical and the other 2 are contemporary. So you are free to ask in between if you want, or you can keep your questions for the end. That's up to you. So the first one is a retrospective exhibition of a historical photographer, Dimitris Letskios. That came a bit early in my career as a curator. Imagine that it needed about 3 years of work, so I started on it around 2002. It was a large archive of more than 50,000 items. It was located in an apartment in a city that was 220 kilometers from Thessaloniki, so there were issues of access, issues of availability of the archive to be studied, and we try to resolve it. Here is a view for you of the photographer himself, a true character in his own way. So we found a way by sending one of our associates for 10 days in Volos. He photographed all the pages with the negatives in low resolution and came back. We inverted the shots to positive, and I started working on them for more than a year, maybe a year and a half, trying to locate possible points of interest, trying to locate the main parts of this archive. What did he talk about? What was it about? What was he looking for? And then we sent again the same photographer in Volos, having selected a number of around 2,000 out of the whole 50,000+ to make a higher resolution photograph. And I worked from it for maybe another year to cut down to 150 works, which was the final exhibition number of works. So that was a really tough work, but also very interesting one. And this is, for example, one of the results of the work, how it was divided in different parts, how it was understood that he had some topics in which he persisted looking for. And it's obvious in my mind, even now that I'm looking at it after 20 years, that if you take this number of 11 parts and look at it closely, you'll see that 9.5 of them have to do with the countryside. So he was a person living in the city, but pursuing a kind of work that was executed, performed in the countryside, in the open space. No matter if it had to do with landscape or people or both, or taking photographs of the traditional ways, because he was a post-war photographer from the mid-30s up until the early 90s. That's a typical photograph of his work. I'm pretty sure if we take a close look at the Bulgarian tradition, we'll find similar photographs from the post-war period, because there were similar things to look for. But in this case, the research that I did, and I will explain more about it later on, led to the conclusion that he was not taking photographs of women, for example, just out of a casual way. Look at this portrait of women in this mountainous landscape, the steep rock, and the old woman dressed in black, because after the Civil War, many families were left without men in the house. And one of the most interesting parts of the photograph, if you agree, is the way she's clutching her fist, as if persisting in everything that is against an easy life. Or this photograph, which is telling by itself the woman that is pregnant and is still working in the fields, and occasionally giving birth in the field at that time. So by doing some research and talking to his environment, I interviewed all his friends, I think, in Volos. I went several times. I managed to find a text on an exhibition he did in 1975, just a year after the dictatorship fall. It was presented in the city of Volos, and it had to do absolutely and only with women of the countryside. And in this short statement, Dimitris stated that I am deliberately photographing the women of the open space of the countryside, because I have lived with them for a while, and I know that they live in a state of permanent depression, oppression, and deprivation. And so I understood that these were not just plain photographs of the countryside works, but a statement about the condition of women in the mid-70s and the 60s, even at a time when in Greece there was not even a feminist movement. So that's something that excited me a lot, and it seemed to me a lot more political. And this photograph is also political in a way, because he's taking photographs of a lake that was dried out, in a way altering the landscape. So it has environmental issues behind it. Now, half a century after that, the state decided that this was a wrong move to make, and they decided to create the lake again, which is not an easy thing to do. So the landscape was entangled in this difficult condition, and Dimitris was there taking photographs of his beloved Mount Pelion and greater Thessaly area. And this is one of his photographs, I would say, that have to do with the people working in the countryside of Greece in various kind of works, a nice landscape with the skeleton of the boat and an island in view. All this, which photograph shows us another part of his work, maybe less artistic, maybe a bit more documentary, but still very useful because he believed a lot in the role of tradition and studying how the plain people lived. So he did several typologies, I would say, of things at a time when the idea of typology was not exactly known in Greece. For example, the scarecrow, and he would photograph different kinds of scarecrows all over the plain and how people used different materials to keep the birds away from their crop. And of course, he did photographs in his city of Volos, his beloved city. Again, after studying his archive and seeing all the photographs he did in the city, a far smaller amount of photographs in regard with the countryside, one can understand that he almost never took a photograph of what we would say was the higher class of the city. And there is one in Volos. Never. All the photographs he was taking were from plain people working on the street, making the money of the day, so to speak. So again, one understands how the photographer stands against his subject matter, and it seems that it doesn't matter if he's in the countryside or the city, but he is always looking at the view of the plain person who has nobody to tell his story or depict him in a way that is somehow meaningful. In this case, a photographer, so a fellow artist. And this is a view of the promenade of the city of Volos, which is a far more distant view, but still very pleasing to see, I would say, if you agree. So it was a very wonderful experience, and I needed to learn a lot of things in order to understand what was behind Mr. Dimitris Letskios' work. He was already at his 90s, he was 92, and he was clear, but he could not be of much help. He didn't remember when his photographs were taken. That's why all the photographs are undated, as you see. We date them by saying simply post-war period or post-junta period. But he didn't recall when, and in many cases where the photographs were taken. And this is the photograph, that is a curatorial choice that you can estimate. This is a photograph that was used for the cover of the book and for the banner of the exhibition. And in my mind, it was not the best photograph of the exhibition, but it was suitable for that purpose because it is taken from a village in Pilion that was his beloved village. He used to stay there the whole summer and make exhibitions, small exhibitions, and he would give out photographs to the people, the inhabitants, and he was saying rather proudly, I don't think there is a house in this village, Makronitsa, that there isn't a photograph of mine in the house. There must be at least one in every house. So it's his beloved village looking down the city of Volos, which is his, which was his city, and in between stands a man dressed in a traditional costume, which was another topic of his great interest. So in a way, it summarizes, it makes a concise statement about what this work was about. Or at least that was my idea of how the photograph works, and I think he wasn't against that idea. That's a photograph of the exhibition hall part of it. It is a bit sentimental for me because the back that you are looking at is the back of my wife holding our 2.5-year-old son. Now he's 20 years old and he's a student at the university. So every time I look at it, it has a sentimental view, not only because of the exhibition, but because of how much time passed ever since. And I would try to summarize enough of what has been said and explained briefly so far by using a few phrases that we can discuss if you want later on. How can one approach such an archive without making mistake, without understanding wrongly? That is always a danger. That is always an idea that hits alarms in my mind. And the first one is the availability of the archive. The possibility to have the archive near you in some safe way as a natural object for research and study. Without this, everything else becomes in some way secondary. And the photographer's opinion, if he is in life and can contribute, is always very valuable. But again, studying the material, you understand sometimes things that even the photographer has not observed or that he has not assessed very well. And it has happened to me in discussing with photographers, and with Stratos, we had such discussions about the work of photographers many times. The second is the defining of the research methodology. How can you approach all of this? As I explained before, it's not easy to look at an archive of 50, or in another occasion that happened to me, 120,000 negatives and make sense. You have to find a way to go through it, to start making groups of photographs that can help you understand how this is structured, how it evolved through time, and what were the different phases that it evolved. So you have to build your own methodology, which I'm afraid it's not valid if you go to another archive. You have to invent another methodology for another archive, because there are not two photographers that are alike. Everyone has his or her own secret paths to look for. And that is, for me, one of the most important part of the research, to understand the archive structure. What are the basic parts? What was he or her looking for? In the case of Lectios, the understanding was that he was a person living not necessarily with his full will in the city, and he was looking for freedom outside the city. He would take photographs, he would walk up to the mountain and walk back from the mountain in order to be able to feel free and take photographs of his beloved villages and the life there and the people and the landscape and everything that seemed so important to him. And then you have to find a way to have a fair representation of all these parts. For example, if the city's part is very small in the whole archive, it cannot be half of the exhibition. It will have to have an analogical part of representation within the whole thing. So you have to be able, in your mind, to understand how is it possible in an exhibition to give to the visitor who doesn't have an idea about all this, what was the main emphasis in this work, and if possible, why? This may be in written form. And then, as I implied before, it's always very useful to study not just the photographer's work, but the whole environment around it, his library. Talk to his friends, what kind of photography magazines, for example, he read, colleagues that he worked with, and be able to understand the broader profile of who the person was and what was he doing. I was amazed to find out by interviewing many of his friends that were very eager to talk about him, that their views never conflicted. They were always overlapping and adding information, but they were all pointing towards the same direction into what was in his mind and how the city was looking at him as a persona with his long hair and the camera always hanging from his shoulder. And all the idea and the picture I got from studying gave a much more clear picture of the person and, of course, the work. And then, of course, comes the moment which is not easy to make a kind of technical, conceptual, where necessary, aesthetic and historical evaluation of that work. How does it stand? What are the main traits? Why was he photographing this way, if there is an answer to that? Maybe there's not. And here I can tell you an inside story of the opening day. That was in June 2005. Months before that, I visited the old man in his apartment in Volos. I had him kind of a grandfather, and this is how I was talking about him when he was not present. I was referring to him as the grandfather. So I visited the grandfather and showed to him all the photographs that I had selected for the exhibition. So what do you think? Everything's fine. You go ahead. Everything is okay. And we discussed some technical aspects. I asked again if he knew and could remember captions and dates, and that was not very helpful, this part of conversation. And then I go back to Thessaloniki and we enter the production phase. We prepare everything, prints, frames, everything's there, and a few other things. And the day of the opening, he shows up, and I'm a bit scared of how it would look to him, because you don't want to disappoint a 92-year-old man. I'm a bit scared about how it would look to him. And he enters the exhibition hall, aided by a woman that was taking care of him. And after seeing about 1/3 of the exhibition, he turns to me and says to me, "Everything is perfect, but tell me something. Why are all my photographs square?" And I said to him in panic, "What do you mean? Your negatives are square. I mean, we didn't do anything wrong. We didn't fucked up. Sorry for my friends. In any way, your negatives are square." Okay. And then I'm thinking to myself that, okay, he wasn't printing himself because he was working his full day in the family bakery. That's how he earned his living. He wasn't living by his photography. And he was sending all his films to be processed to his fellow photographer, Takis Tloupas, in the city of Laris, half an hour distance. And he was a professional photographer with a studio and darkroom and everything. And Tloupas would print for him his selected negatives. But at the time, all the papers were 24 by 30, for example, or 20 by 24, so they wouldn't fit a square negative in full print. So Tloupas was cropping his photographs in order to not waste the paper, and he got accustomed to seeing his photographs cropped. So I understood that maybe he didn't have a clear view of his photographs the way they were presented in the exhibition. But again, that lasted a minute. Okay, everything okay. And then, of course, it's the photographer's biography, what you understand by the way he lived and how that enhances his or her photography, which is important. And in his case, it was indeed important because his whole life suggested that he was on the side of the plain people, on the side of the underprivileged. So again, it makes sense when real life and photography coincide in a very specific way. And what is a very difficult task for a curator to do is to think if he or she can propose a small place for this person with 50 years of photographic work in the history of Greek photography. So my idea on that was that he belonged in this small group of 3 plus him 4 male photographers that were roaming the countryside in the post-war period. It was Balafas, Tloupas, and Melegis. Only he was the unknown one. He was the lesser known. Balafas was very well known, and Melegis, because they photographed very well, and they photographed also the resistance during the Second World War. And Tloupas was an established photographer in the heart of Greece. But Lectios was fairly lesser known, although he did a work of a high quality as well. So the idea is to propose to people to think of him as one among other important photographers of a specific time frame in the history of Greek photography. That's how, at least, I came to understand it. So that was the first case that I tried to explain in short. The whole trip lasted 3 years, 3 wonderful years doing this trip into post-war Greece and very interesting photography. Now I will turn to more contemporary work and work that poses other kind of questions, perhaps, to a curator's mind, as I will try to point. Susan Meiselas is an international photographer having a career from the mid-70s on that is highly celebrated internationally. No need for many of you for introductions. She has been a Magnum photographer since the late 70s and president of Magnum, but much more than that, she has been doing a very significant and very unique body of work apart from her clearly photojournalistic work. In 2008, we decided in the context of the Photo Biennale to invite her reframing history project, which I have to explain first and then take you to the 2008. And this project started in 1979. I co-curated this exhibition in Thessaloniki with Jan Erik Lundström, the Swedish good colleague. So we go back to 1979 when Susan is taking photographs of the revolution in Nicaragua. Not an easy task to do. She stayed there for a year, entering the jungle to find the rebels and take photographs. And it was a brave thing for a journalist to do, and for a woman journalist as well. She succeeded in all possible terms, as you will see. And these are a few of the well-known photographs from this project. One of also the first journalistic projects to be carried out in full color. It was not exactly the case in the late 70s. There was still a domination of black and white. So Susan, as I was telling, was doing all these wonderful important journalistic work updating the public opinion all over the world on how this revolution was carried out until its triumph in 1980. This was perhaps the most famous photograph out of this. It's a bit ironic if you notice that the man is throwing a Molotov in a glass bottle of Pepsi. So he's throwing the Molotov against the building of the National Guard of a dictatorship in his country being supported by the US, sending against them a Pepsi bottle. And this photograph became an iconic work in local history. It became a photograph that was reproduced in the textbooks in schools. It became a stamp. But also, apart from being an emblematic photograph in her seminal 1981 photo book on Nicaragua, it was voted by the editors of Time as one of the most influential 100 photographs of the 20th century. That's an honor, indeed. But apart from the honor of the editors of Time magazine, the people of Nicaragua had also an opinion on that. They made a political poster out of it. And they made a stencil on the walls out of it. That's a peculiar thing for a photographer to experience, to have your work being reproduced, even minimized somehow in such ways. They made a popular monument out of it in Esteli. Esteli was a village in which there was fierce battle during the revolution. And they made a mural out of it. So it was pretty much everywhere, all over the public space. And Susan did know about all this because she was coming back in Nicaragua. And even Banksy had a look at it and reproduced it in a way in Jerusalem on another context that had to do with homophobia, a homophobic incident in Jerusalem, but still the motif was taken out of Susan's original work. And even Pepsi used it, which is funny and not funny as well at the same time. And that has to do with the influence of the image and the work itself, of which the photographer had a conscience. And I'm telling that because in 2004, she visited back Nicaragua. She is printing some of her photographs, very large, as you can see, in a waterproof vinyl material that can be hanged in outdoor spaces. And she's putting her photographs in the exact places where these photographs were taken 25 years before, asking the people and herself as well, what changed in these 25 years after the revolution? Did anything change after all? They had pretty much the same level of corruption. The landscape around was pretty much the same. You can see people talking about the photographs. Some of them were alive, were born at the time, so they had first-hand experience. Others are younger and had only second-hand experience about what happened in the times of the revolution. So she enters this dialogue with the people, interviewing people, and in a way questioning her own work. What did we manage to do? If this is a celebrated book, and if this is a celebrated work, and it was voted as a photograph that is this and that, how did it help, after all? All these people, how did it affect their life? And I found this a very original gesture, showing also the photographer's genuine interest on the lives of people and not just following the news. So, and this is a second example of the same installation in public space. So this is the work that we wanted to bring into Thessaloniki, because we thought that it's a great example of a person recollecting on his own work which is important by itself. It's part of the history of photography, but that doesn't stop her from thinking on it again and putting it to the judgment of the people on a second time, on public view. So the question is, how do you show this work in Thessaloniki? This is now the curatorial part we discussed with Jan Erik. How do you show this? To put it in public space in Thessaloniki doesn't really have any meaning because it does not reflect the people's history. It comes from the outside as an outside story. To put it in a museum is always okay, but is this the best way to do it? Is there another choice? If yes, which? And I indicated to Jan Erik this solution, which is a former military camp, a former military barrack, which I thought it was suitable. And what's the interesting part? That was a former Ottoman military building, which means that implied there is another conflict between the Greece and Turkey for the liberation of Greece. So this is a barrack which changed hands between armies, just like Nicaragua did, between the dictatorship and the rebels. It was abandoned, but also next to it, there was a very highly guarded, small, active military camp which housed K4. K4 was the peacekeeping force for Kosovo sent by NATO. So they had their base in Thessaloniki, and they were sending people and officers in Kosovo to take care of the military business there. So their camp was right next to this. And it all was becoming very interesting and upsetting. I remember that because of the festival, Alison Nordstrom, which was at the time, 15 years ago, the head curator of George Eastman collection in Rochester, and we discussed about this exhibition, and she said to me, listen, I know Susan many years. Every time I fly from New York, I stay at her studio. She's a very close friend. Believe me, if you take out the original installation in Nicaragua, there has never been a better presentation than this one, because it has so many second thoughts about the environment. So I'm excited. I'm going to tell her all about it. So that was a great pleasure for me. And also, there was another thing that was important in my mind. As the images were semi-transparent, and these images were reflecting on history, it was interesting to see other photographs through them and recollect on the idea of history. Like this, for example. So you were looking at one photograph through another. And that was also an implication about the layers of history and how they unfold in front of your eyes. Needless to say that the space was not an exhibition space. We had to put lights on it. The lights were not proper. I mean, the lighting was not perfect. But the idea and the environment, I think, was very suggestive. And if there is some success on it, I think that was it. So, if I can share with you some of the questions that have to do with these issues, we have dealt many times, and me personally, with these questions. How do we present work at a space which is not a museum and not a gallery? Is it always easy to overcome the historical, social weight that these spaces carry on them? For example, in Thessaloniki, we have the Rotunda, which is a Roman mausoleum and became a Christian church and an Ottoman mosque, and then again a Christian church, and now it's a UNESCO monument which is being claimed by the church, and the city resists, and it's somewhere in between. But this is a monument by itself. People visit it every day. in large numbers because they want to see the building and the monument. If you put something in it, can you put something in it that does not enter into a dialogue with history and the monument itself? And how would that end? In many cases where I've seen such exhibitions, it ends up, if there's not a dialogue, I mean, it ends up in a result in which the monument sucks up the exhibition, and you tend to see the monument rather than the exhibition. So, is it always affordable to have a perfect match? Can we always find the best possible space for an exhibition of a specific context? No. Maybe we can't, but we can look for. We can put our head to think for something that is better than the ordinary, for something that comes closer. And occasionally you can hit that moment in which the two work together in the best possible way. So these are questions I imagine that have to do with all fellow curators. And the third project I would like to bring into your consideration is one that's even more contemporary. We presented it 2021 in the Photo Biennale of Thessaloniki, and then a year after in Athens at the Benaki Museum by Samuel Bianchini. It's written that it is from 2007 up to today because he updates the installation every time that he is doing it with new elements and new technology. Samuel is a very peculiar and very interesting case of an artist standing somewhere in between art and new technologies. He's very well aware of what is going on with new technologies. He's head of a lab in Paris that is doing research on new technologies and art. But what I am fond of in his case is that he doesn't use technology as a way to show off, but he's blending it with very interesting contexts that are meaningful and many times political, which is very fine with my personal taste. So this is the look of what the exhibition space would seem to someone who would enter. You enter a dark space and you have in front of you, frontally, a screen that is 5 meters long and 2 meters tall in height, which has this blurry image in which you cannot understand. You can just discern some shapes that maybe have to do with human bodies, but this is it. You don't understand. Occasionally, some people entered the space and thinking that this is not a work, they left. And we were discussing it with Samuel, and I told him, well, isn't that sometimes the case with contemporary art? People just don't understand and leave. So they didn't find anything interest for their taste. They didn't want to engage themselves with the work, so they left the space. But if you came closer, you understood gradually that the image became clearer, but only for your height and shape of your body, not the whole image. And as you step more closely, the image was becoming even more clear. And at 50-centimeter distance, it would become sharply focused, and you would be face-to-face with a riot policeman of the French police in full arm, and that was a delicate moment. Against authority, face-to-face, image to person. But in this case, peculiarly enough, the citizen has the upper hand. He or she can move around, and by moving can cause the image to become clear or not clear. He or she can move out and make the image fuzzy again. And he or she can study the policeman without him being able to resist on that. And also, interestingly enough, you cannot see the whole piece by yourself. You need more people to be with you. So it's a collective work. you discover it along with other people. As well, you see that people, in order to understand the image and what is behind the blur, they start to move their body parts, so they become performance in an interactive work by their own will, which is also interesting. And this is how the name of the work evolved. Niform is the word uniform. If you take you out, the you is you, is the audience. The people that come in and make the work full, because without audience, there is no work. Okay, so that was the idea, which I found very intriguing, and an idea that used really technology in a very clever way. And now I would like to show you the backside of it, how it was, so to say, constructed and built, maybe in a short description. Samuel had to work for this work with his software designer. They were both in Thessaloniki for 10 days. We constructed this metal structure that you can see. Now we are at the back of the screen, okay? At the back space, not the exhibition space. So we had to construct this large structure that holded the screen, and placed it when he was in Thessaloniki. He attended everything, every detail of the exact distance because of the projection. So that was one part. Then we hung the screen carefully and put weight at the bottom side for it to be fully flat. And then they went into another stage of installing 9 LiDAR infrared cameras in a way that they were invisible on top in the ceiling in the exhibition hall. So these cameras were detecting the human presence, the shape, and the distance, and they were informing the computer. And because of the software, it was possible, this interaction between the human shape and the image to take place. So the image was becoming clearer at the exact shape and height of the visitor. So that was a very delicate installation for them to make. It required many hours, a couple of days, and they had to hide everything, everything with black cables and black tapes. Nothing was visible on the dark side. And then there was Colin's work. Colin was the software designer who, after the cameras were installed, have to take care of all the software adjustments that needed to be made with trial and error in order to make sure that there was this exact effect being performed with people entering the space. This is a projection now of the monitor, and this is the monitor of Colin, in which he was controlling the parameters of the work. So what I'm trying to say by showing you this, and this is a way to show you also a work that I really admire very much, is that in some cases, the curator is not responsible for maybe selecting a number of works or selecting the size of the prints or this kind of more conventional decisions. Photography is changing. It has become much more complicated. It has become often an environment rather than an exhibition on the wall. And in this case, the curator is becoming more and more supportive to the artist to build the kind of environment that he or she needs for his or her work. In this case, it meant that despite the fact that we had the festival being under organization, and we had another 23 or 24 exhibitions, I had to be there some hours every day in order to be the mediator between them and everything that surrounded them in Greece. They needed a cable, they needed a faster internet connection, because Colin was, after the opening and when they left for Paris, he would take maintenance of the work through the internet connection from his Paris computer. He would control the parameters of the work despite being in Paris. So he needed a faster connection. And all sorts of important details that you need to take care of. It's not a very interesting, maybe, work, but it's challenging to see the final result. And that was, I think, very rewarding, if you agree. So, ending my presentation, I would like to share with you some of the thoughts I have been making about curating that regard all these 30 years, or at least my stance in issues of curating. First and foremost, no exhibition or publication can be properly curated or edited without the actual trust of the artists or occasionally their families that you will treat their own work, their child, as if it was your own. If there's not this relationship of trust, there's not a steady base from which a curator can work. That is very important. Second, which I found out, and maybe Nadia can add her experience on that, an exhibition and the publication often involves a small or large compromise. First of all, curators don't always select the exhibitions they make. In this career of 30 years, it's only a handful of cases that I have selected myself the exhibitions I have made, and that was in the senior, mostly part of this career. In the first years and middle years, I didn't select practically almost anything. So not only that, but you have a view in your mind about how you would like to see this exhibition performed, but due to the space, due to the lack of budget, due to the lack of time or other factors, you cannot see it realized the way you thought it. There is compromise involved in many cases, and that's something I have experienced. Another very important factor for me is that the curator must not forget that he or she serves the work of somebody else. It's not your show, it's somebody else's show. Okay. The best curating in my mind is the one that serves the exhibition and doesn't try to show off. If someone comes into the exhibition of Olga, for example, and say, what a wonderful work, not what a wonderful curating, what a wonderful work this is, then the curator has succeeded, because your work is to bring the photographs into attention, not for people who come in to say, look at what wonderful curating he did. It's not your show, I insist. The other thing which I implied while talking about Dimitris' lectures, how do you represent the different parts of a work in a larger exhibition, which is very often the case of exhibitions I have to deal with? How do you take care of the large picture, what the show looks like, without ruining the smaller relationships between photographs and parts of the exhibition? This needs also attention. The other thing that I'm aiming for, at least, is that the overall result must look superior to the sum of the parts. What does that mean? If you have an exhibition of 60 works, for example, and they are properly selected, properly grouped and sequenced and presented, they might look like 100. They bond together in a way that they can imply something larger than the number of works present in the exhibition hall. So the spectator can or should be looking and feeling for a show or a book the way that he or she has with good food. Maybe the spectator is not a cook. Maybe he or she does not know how food is cooked, but they can tell when a food is good. They can tell when it's well cooked. They can smell it when it's like that. So this is something to take into consideration again. And once we used the metaphor of cooking, let's not forget the French school, which is famous all over the world, that the best food is cooked in slow fire, which means that curating needs time, needs it's not something that one can do in a rush. It's not done in 1 week or 1 month. It requires time and distance to see and visualize as clearly as possible. And lastly, curating is always an equation with too many variants, not always at the control of the curator. And it always has uncountable backstage, dirty, in quotes, work that doesn't show, which means, in my opinion, that a curator is not the person who is just taking decisions, just selecting a number of works. It's a person who translates captions, corrects things on the wall, inspects the prints, is doing a lot of communication and backstage work that doesn't show, but it's absolutely necessary for the show to succeed. And it's also absolutely necessary for him to have a full grip of all these factors to the extent that he or she is responsible for this exhibition. So, I couldn't agree more with Geoffrey Batson than this phrase of his. Collecting, he said, is like creating a kind of order. It implies meanings. So does curating. It implies meaning. It's an interpretation of one work, and this is why the artist has to be in agreement with that, because he might or she might not like that interpretation. But it's an interpretation of things, always. Thank you very much for your attention.